They said the deal was finished, politically buried under years of resistance and quietly abandoned in the corridors of Brussels. But what happened next did not just revive it. It rewrote the rules of how power itself operates inside the European Union. Because when stepped onto that stage thousands of miles away from the European capital, she did not merely announce a trade agreement. She signalled something far more profound, something that felt, to many watching, like a shift in the very architecture of European democracy. Before we roll the footage, just one thing. If you enjoy our work, drop a like and hit subscribe. Over 98% of you are watching without subscribing. Let's change that right now. It's free for you, but it fuels everything we do. Subscribed? Perfect. Now enjoy the video. To understand how this moment became possible, you have to go back to the quiet beginnings of a process that was never meant to explode into public view. A process that unfolded behind closed doors in Brussels, where legal teams, policy advisors and senior officials worked through dense pages of treaty law, searching not for consensus, but for possibility. And according to reports later referenced by And I, what they found was not a loophole in the traditional sense, but something more subtle and far more powerful, a legal pathway embedded deep within the European Union's institutional framework that had existed for years, yet had never been pushed to its absolute limit. At the same time, political pressure across Europe was reaching a breaking point, with farmers staging protests that stretched across national borders, or tractors lining highways in scenes that felt less like demonstrations and more like warnings, while leaders such as and made their opposition unmistakably clear, arguing not only that the deal posed economic risks, but that its enforcement mechanisms were dangerously weak, raising questions that went beyond trade and into the realm of accountability, sovereignty and trust. The agreement itself had been decades in the making, a complex negotiation between the European Union and a South American bloc whose economic potential had long been recognised but never fully unlocked. And on paper it promised enormous benefits, opening markets, reducing tariffs and creating opportunities for industries that had been pushing for access for years. Yet beneath that promise lay a fundamental imbalance. One that critics argued would expose European farmers to competition under entirely different regulatory conditions, a concern that was not theoretical, but rooted in hard economic realities. As opposition solidified, a coalition began to form, not as a formal alliance, but as a convergence of national interests, with France, Italy and several other countries effectively creating a political barrier strong enough to halt the agreement under normal circumstances. And for a moment it appeared that this would be the end of the story. Another ambitious trade deal delayed indefinitely by the complex machinery of European consensus. But while Europe was debating, something else was happening quietly and with increasing urgency, because across the Atlantic, expectations were rising, markets were reacting. And leaders in South America were preparing for a breakthrough that many believed was finally within reach. And it was within this growing contrast between European hesitation and global anticipation that the decision was made to act. The trip to was not just symbolic, it was strategic, creating distance from the immediate political pressures of Brussels, while placing the announcement in a setting that underscored the global nature of the agreement. And when von der Leyen took the stage, the message was delivered with a calm certainty that only amplified its impact, because there was no indication of hesitation, no acknowledgement of the divisions that had defined the debate up to that point. Only the declaration that the deal was moving forward. The reaction in Europe was immediate and intense, with officials scrambling to understand not just the implications of the agreement itself, but the process by which it had been advanced, as legal experts, policymakers and political leaders all confronted the same unsettling question. How had this been possible without full approval from the member states that were supposed to guide such decisions? The answer lay in the concept of provisional application, a mechanism that allows parts of an agreement falling under EU exclusive competence to be implemented before full ratification. A technical provision that had been used before, but never in a way that carried such sweeping political consequences. And while von der Leyen's team argued that this approach was entirely within the legal framework of the European Union, and critics quickly pointed out that legality and legitimacy are not always the same. Scholars from institutions such as began to weigh in, describing the move as a test of the system's boundaries, while analysts speaking to warned that the precedent set by this decision could extend far beyond the current agreement, potentially reshaping how future policies are implemented when consensus proves difficult to achieve. Meanwhile, the public response was driven less by legal nuance and more by emotion, as farmers returned to the streets with a renewed sense of urgency. Their protests now fueled not only by economic concerns, but by a perception that their voices had been bypassed, a sentiment captured in interviews broadcast by where demonstrators spoke openly about feeling excluded from a decision that would directly impact their livelihoods. The polls conducted by organisations such as indicated a growing scepticism toward European institutions, reflecting a broader shift in public sentiment that extended beyond the specifics of the trade deal and into questions about representation and accountability, while inside the European Parliament, debates intensified as lawmakers struggled to reconcile the economic arguments in favour of the agreement with the political and ethical concerns raised by its implementation. Supporters framed the decision as a necessary step in a rapidly changing global landscape, arguing that Europe could not afford to remain stalled while other regions moved forward, emphasising the potential benefits for industries ranging from automotive manufacturing to pharmaceuticals, and portraying the agreement as a strategic move designed to strengthen Europe's position on the world stage. Opponents, however, focused on the process, arguing that the method used to advance the deal risked undermining the very principles that the European Union was built upon, warning that if decisions of this magnitude could be taken without full consensus, it could lead to a gradual erosion of trust between member states and the institutions meant to serve them. The global response added another layer of complexity as governments and markets around the world reacted to the sudden shift, with some viewing it as a sign of European decisiveness and others interpreting it as evidence of internal instability. And in countries directly involved in the agreement, the reaction was largely positive, reflecting the economic opportunities that the deal was expected to create. Yet even as the immediate effects began to take shape, the longer-term consequences remained uncertain, because the real impact of this moment was not limited to trade flows or market access, but extended into the realm of governance, raising fundamental questions about how decisions are made, who has the authority to make them, and what happens when established processes are pushed to their limits. Von der Leyen defended her actions by emphasising the strategic importance of the agreement, presenting it as a forward-looking decision aimed at securing Europe's economic future. But for many critics, the issue was not the outcome, but the precedent. The idea that a single decision could alter the balance of power within a system designed to distribute it. Now, as legal challenges began to take shape and political debates continued to unfold, it became clear that the story was far from over, because what had happened in Montevideo was not an isolated event, but a catalyst, triggering a broader conversation about the nature of authority within the European Union and the mechanisms that govern it. And that conversation is still evolving, with each new development adding another layer of complexity to a situation that has already tested the limits of the system, leaving policymakers, analysts and citizens alike grappling with questions that do not have easy answers. Will this decision ultimately be seen as a necessary act of leadership in a moment of stagnation, or as a step too far in the use of institutional power? And how will it shape the future of European governance in the years to come? And because if there is one thing this moment has made clear, it is that the balance between efficiency and accountability is more fragile than it appears. So now Europe finds itself at a crossroads, facing not just the challenge of implementing a controversial trade agreement, but the deeper task of reassessing the structures that allowed it to happen. And as the debate continues, one question remains at the centre of it all. a question that will define the next chapter of this story and perhaps the future of the European Union itself. Was this the moment Europe moved forward, or the moment it lost control of how it decides to move at all? And if the answer is still unfolding, how much further can the system be pushed before something finally gives? Because the next decision, the next crisis, the next test of power may already be closer than anyone expects. And when it arrives, the consequences could be even more profound. Stay watching, because what happens next will not just determine the fate of this agreement. It will determine the future of how Europe governs itself and whether the lines that were crossed can ever truly be redrawn.